Hello, everybody. Um, Welcome to the video that we're going to deal with talking about drawing still lifes. That's going to be our first big drawing of this year in Art 1. We've been over it a little bit in class, but I am going to do a quick review of some of the things we've already been over, and then we will start going over some new things about the actual process of drawing. So first, I just want to talk about what materials we're going to need for this drawing. Mainly your sketchbook, so your trusty black sketchbooks that you all have, or if you have, other sheets of paper, that's fine. But you're going to definitely want this. You're going to want a couple of different pencils. I have an ebony and a number 2 pencil along with an eraser, and of course off to the side here I also have my trusty pencil sharpener. Everyone has one of these little guys, or any other pencil sharpener will do. If you have the one that I gave you, you're going to want some kind of little tray or something to put your shavings in while you draw, so you don't have to keep getting up and go into the trash can. So, get a little index card, fold up the sides like I showed you in class, or if you have a little, lid of some kind or something off to the side, you can use that. Or if you're really fancy and you have one of these pencil sharpeners that, you can keep the shavings inside, that'll save you some time, but not totally necessary. Then, of course, you're going to need, once the actual drawing starts, a couple sheets of this larger drawing paper that I have not given you yet, but I will give you pretty soon. Then finally, well, not finally, you also can, and this is something you might not have at home, I have these here in the classroom. I have just like a board that I use to draw sometimes. It often helps if you kind of draw at an angle, have the, board tilted up towards you so that it's kind of at a perpendicular view of your eye level. If you sometimes draw flat on a table and you're leaning back away from your paper, you can sometimes get distortions in your drawing. Finally, you're going to want a nice well-lit area to draw from. I'm at a desk here at my house. Got my little crazy video set up here. And then finally, I've got my still life set up. Now, I set up a board in the background because sometimes, the objects in the background can be a little distracting. So, if you have a piece of board or something to set up, like this is one of my wife's sewing crochet boards that she has. It's got like a grid on the other side of it. I just sort of propped it up to use as a backdrop. But you don't have to. It's just optional. And then finally, I've got my objects here that I've been arranging. I've got a bunch here on the side that I didn't use. Again, as I told you guys last week, when you're gathering objects, you should get more than you need, and then just whittle it down, try different things, and then narrow it down to, anywhere from, I don't know, I tend to go use maybe more objects than I maybe should, but I kind of like having that complexity there. So I've got, 7 or 8. But I would have it minimum of 5 or 6 in your still life. No more than 8, I would say. This is what I have is probably enough. And, make sure that the objects are pretty portable. So that way, if you're taking them back and forth between home and school, they'll be easy to carry. These are all pretty portable. They will all fit inside a small bag. They're not terribly fragile. I just have to be a little careful with the bottle if I were to take it somewhere. But pretty much it's pretty easy to take this, set it up somewhere else if I need to. I know if you're at home and maybe you're set up at the kitchen table or somewhere, you might need to clear away your stuff when it's dinner time, find another place for it. So if you don't have a permanent place to set your still life, picking portable objects is always a good thing. So don't be drawing these really heavy, big objects that are hard to transport. Okay. So let's go over the process really quickly. Now that we've kind of gone over the materials and what you need, I've sort of already set up the still life, but let's talk a little bit about our process. So first of all, you're going to want to choose your objects. You're going to want objects that have a variety in size and scale, shape, texture, detail, etc. Let's look at our objects that we have, both these and the other ones that I actually used. Do these show a variety in all those criteria? Size and scale, shape, texture, detail. Yes, I would say so. There's no, I have a few really simple objects like the pear, the bottle, and this little spoon holder. But I also have, objects that are more complex, like this plant, a fake plant, by the way, the fake flower, the skull, okay? I have different shapes of objects, all right? A lot of them are pretty round, but I've got that block in there to kind of give a nice offset to all the round things. All right, so they kind of play off each other well. I've got some round cylindrical or oval objects. I've got some straight edges mixed with curved edges. I've got, some nice straight, weird segmentation going on in the vase of the plant that I think helps to offset it as well, which is kind of cool. Some really nice, delicate details in the flowers, the little serrated edge on the leaves and the petals. A lot of nice detail in there, very subtle. Some interesting details in the skull. But then you've got, really simple spool, a really simple pear. The lime's pretty simple. I've got my little Batman guy just because I don't know, I like him. He's one of my favorite little toys that I have. All right, so, I've got a variety. But I've also had other things that I didn't use. Some apples, bananas, another couple of blocks here that I had, a little flower, some of these bigger flowers here that I just felt were, once I looked at them, maybe too tall for what I was doing. So, some paintbrushes and paint, which, I was using for another project, but, you could actually use some of those as objects in a still life. Like those tubes of paint are kind of cool shapes that you could use. All right, but that's what I wound up going with. All right, so you don't want to have objects that are all the same shape, that all look alike. Try to change it up and give, play off of contrasts. Contrasts are very important. So big versus small, rough versus smooth, natural versus man-made, etc. All right, next you're going to arrange these objects in an interesting way. So last week we went over several of these helpful terms that you should, if you're not quite clear on them, you can go back to the PowerPoint and check them out. So rule of thirds, the triangle or the triad, what you kind of have here. You can kind of imagine the triangle, with the tallest object kind of being near the middle. All right. Rule of thirds, I'll go over that in a minute. That's where you divide up your paper into three, like a grid with three equal lines, horizontally and vertically. Figure ground, which is negative space. All right, so we've done rule of thirds, done the triangle. Figure ground is negative space. So look for interesting negative space in between the objects and around the objects. All right, I kind of like what's happening, you know, under here, around here with the little bumpy leaves. There's some interesting stuff happening in here, especially all that cool negative space. Okay, up in here. All right, so think about negative space, how to design that. Leading lines, which is where you are, you know, leading the viewer's eye around the composition with either repetitions of shapes or with the edges kind of leading into another. So you see how the edges of the leaves kind of come down and kind of pick up the edge of the skull. Then you've got the pear down here kind of curving into that. The lime kind of leads us to this direction with the spoon. The stem of the spoon leads us back up here. That catches the back edge of the vase, and then we're back up here again. So you kind of got this nice flow, circulation happening. All right, and then finally hierarchy. All right, you have to have a scale of, you know, biggest to smallest objects. So you want your bigger objects to be kind of in the background, the taller ones, and then maybe smaller objects are in the foreground. So we pretty much have that, you know, like the flower, the bottle, the skull, the plant are kind of in the background, and then we've got the smaller objects like the Batman and the spool and stuff kind of more in the foreground or the middle ground as well. All right, so we have chosen some interesting objects that have good variety, and we have arranged those objects in an interesting, pleasing way using some of these rules. All right, then thumbnails. Thumbnail sketches in your sketchbook. Do a lot of these. Now, you don't know this because this is kind of, you're seeing the end result. But before I arrived at this solution, I did a lot of playing around with different objects. So here in my sketchbook, I actually drew some small rectangles and did little rule of thirds grids on them to kind of see how things would line up. And as well as, you know, the whole triad thing. So I'm playing with sketching, you know, the negative space. Does the eye flow through the composition? How big is it on the page in relation to, you know, the entire piece of paper I'm going to be drawing? You know, how big or how small is that still life going to be? I'm not really focused on details at all, nor should you be. Thumbnails are just meant to kind of allow you to think through the composition phase and think about the proportion and scale of objects to one another, where they're arranged, the negative space between objects. It's much easier to control those elements on a smaller scale, which is why, you know, we do them really tiny. You don't want to save these kinds of decisions for when you're actually working on your final drawing. Otherwise, you're going to be doing lots of erasing and redrawing and making lots of mistakes. So you definitely want to do lots of thumbnails. All right, I've done even more. Then I did another page. This time I kind of went vertical with it just to play around with it. You know, just to see how things would go vertically. I brought in some of those yellow flowers, as you can see. I've got some, you know, other details. Then I just sort of was just sketching some objects. I just kind of wanted, you know, just to play around and get used to drawing some of these things. So these are kind of like doodles or maybe more detailed doodles. Definitely don't put this much detail into a thumbnail. This was just me playing around. And then I did another page of thumbnails. And it wasn't until this very last one that I found something that I kind of liked, that I thought worked. So this is the one I went with. But it took me all these other drawings here to arrive at this final solution. And I could have done more. I mean, I could have done pages and pages and pages of these. But again, don't spend tons of time on each one. Just kind of do a quick little study. Don't put a lot of detail in it. And then move on to the next one. And move on to the next one. And then that way you can go back and look at them and kind of pick and choose which ones that you like. And if I hadn't done all of these other thumbnails, I wouldn't have been able to arrive at this solution. So all of this drawing was necessary to get to the stage that I wanted. So don't ever settle for your very first thing. Sometimes you might come back to that. You might decide that that was the best one, but you won't know that for sure until you do more drawing. Okay? So do lots of thumbnails in your sketchbook. And again, they don't have to be super detailed or fancy. Just, practice, and again, practice doodling some of the objects that you're actually going to be drawing. All right, so that's our third stage. Thumbnails, do a lot of them, try different compositions, no details, just focus on shape, scale, and space, positive and negative space. Then our next stage is to actually start drawing our still life on our piece of paper. Whenever, and you'll hear me say this a lot, I like to mention the 3 L's when we are talking about drawing. The 3 L's are light, loose, and large. All right, anytime you are doing any kind of drawing, this is how you should approach it. First, by sketching very light with your pencil. You just want very faint, barely perceptible marks. This is because those types of marks will be easier to erase and redraw, which, is pretty inevitable when you're starting a drawing. You're going to want to give yourself some leeway to, redraw some things, move some things around. Maybe you drew something a little too big or a little too small. You got to scoot it to one side or the other. That's normal. But if you draw really dark lines and you go to erase them, especially if you're using a really soft lead like an ebony pencil, those marks are going to either not come up fully, or you're going to just do lots of erasing and it's just going to get frustrating to you. So you can solve a lot of that problem by simply drawing lighter with your pencil. So again, instead of doing super dark marks, I'm going to focus here real quick on this. So instead of drawing, really dark with your pencil like that, just do very light, sketchy, right? I'm barely putting any pressure down on that pencil. Okay. This way, again, if things are not right, you can erase it. So you don't need it to be drawing this dark this soon. Keep it. And also, that leads us to the second one, which is loose. So you got the light part down. Loose means that you're just kind of making, kind of sketchy. You're almost like ghosting the pencil before you start. Right. Again, for the same reasons. You're kind of trying to find your line. You might not know exactly the right line, so, just sort of getting it. And also you might be doing like foundation lines, things like that. So you just have a very faint line to start off with. find the symmetry of your forms, that sort of thing. Then once you have sort of established what you want to do, then you can go in later with a darker line. Just drawing Batman because it's fun. And you're just kind of following the foundations that you started with. Right? So, light and loose, and then finally draw large. All right? Again, if you look at these still lifes, you'll see that if this represents one of these rectangles represents this huge piece of paper, that's pretty big on that paper. I'm not, you don't want thumbnails that, like, let's say, this is your piece of paper, right? You don't want your still life to be like this tiny, right? You don't want your final drawing to look like this, right? Where you have this tiny still life surrounded by this huge sea of empty white space. That just looks bad. So fill up as much of the page as possible. Okay? So that's what I mean by light, loose, and large. Okay? All right, so that's the first part of our video here. And next up, we're going to actually start blocking out the still life and going through the next stage of the drawing. So stay tuned. All right, folks. Now it's time to start drawing the actual final drawing. So we have done all of our preparation. We have thoughtfully selected a bunch of interesting objects. Nothing boring like your iPhone or something like that. Something with character. Some things that have an interesting shape, texture, details, scale, etc. Remember, you want to play off those contrasts. Smooth versus rough, thick versus thin, man-made versus natural, large versus small, all that stuff. Then you're going to arrange them in a pleasing way, thinking about those things we just talked about. Leading lines, rule of thirds, hierarchy of scale, all that stuff. Then you draw a bunch of thumbnails. And you can, play around with it. In the, I would say the arranging and the thumbnail stage are kind of going on at the same time simultaneously, right? You are doing some studies of one version of your still life, and then you're like, let's change it up a little bit, and then you're going to do some more sketches, and you just give yourself, have fun with it, play with stuff, and see what you come up with. And then you're just arranging and sketching, arranging and sketching. But again, they're really quick, simple doodles. That's what thumbnails are. But you're focused on placement and arrangement and composition. You're not focused on details. Then once you have that finalized and you go back and look at the sketch you want to do, which we have done right here, then you are ready to begin the next phase. So remembering those 3 L's that I just mentioned, right? Light, loose, and large. We are going to start blocking out our composition now on our paper. Our big, I want to say these are 12 by 18 sheets of paper. and I have a bunch of these at school that I'll give you. So you can't see my still life. It is right here in front of me. I showed it to you earlier, but it's still here. Now, I will and I have taken some photos of my still life, which you should do. However, as much as possible, you should work directly from the still life. Have the real objects in front of you. Photos are nice if you don't have any other resource. But photos are not perfect. Photos can really flatten out and distort objects, and you just can't really get a sense of the structure, the volume, the sense of volume or texture or structure of an object unless it's right in front of you. So there's no substitute for that. So as helpful as photographs can be at times, and you definitely want to take some photos of your still life, just in case, something happens, you forget your objects one day, or something unforeseen thing happens, then you've got photos as a backup, but they shouldn't be the main source. All right, so I've got my live still life right here in front of me. Trust me, that flower and that skull look so much better in person than they do in a photograph. So now I'm going to just start thinking about those 3 L's as I block this out. Remember, I'm not thinking about details yet. So I am just very faintly, and I'm using my number 2 right now. I will switch over to my ebony later. If you want to use your ebony, you can, but just be really careful because, again, they're very dark. It's very soft lead, so it's harder, I think, to maybe keep light in those early stages with an ebony. So if you want to use a number 2 pencil or a mechanical pencil in this stage only, I'm fine with that. So I'm looking again at my overall page. And what helps too is if you make a little viewfinder with your hands. You can make one out of like cardboard, but if you just take one hand and kind of make the pointing gesture with both your hands, then you just flip one of them over and kind of mimic the shape of your paper. I've got a rectangular piece of paper, so I'm going to do a rectangular viewfinder, and I'm just holding it up and looking. You can't see me doing this, it's off camera, but I'm looking at my still life and I'm kind of framing it. I'm trying to see how big do I need to draw to get these things to fit comfortably on the page. I don't really want to deal with any cropping, any awkward cropping. So I'm going to try to fit most everything on there as well as comfortably as I can. Remember, you don't want to go too small. So I'm going to have a little bit, based on that, I'll have probably a little bit of room on the sides because of this paper. So I'm just going to kind of notch off. And again, if I need to go a little bit past these marks, that's fine. This is just to help me to see, okay, I don't want to go past kind of these marks here. And again, this will change. Okay. Now I'm just going to very faintly start drawing. I would start with some of the larger objects. So in this case, the flowers or the skull. And I'm just going to start drawing. But I'm just going to block these objects in. What do I mean by blocking them in? It means that I'm just getting the basic scale and proportions of the objects down. Right? I'm not worrying about anything other than scale and proportion right now, and just a sense of, negative space. I'm not even really drawing the shape of the object, really. Like these two lines is like the top and the bottom of the pear. The square is kind of the basic scale of the skull. The skull's on a little block right here. I'm just going to very faintly block in a few of those edges. I'm not worrying about any kind of details yet. And why is that? Because at this point, details would be a waste of my time. There's no point in drawing this super detailed object right off the bat, and only to find later on that it's too big or too small, and the rest of my composition isn't going to fit on my drawing. Then I'd have to just erase it and redraw it anyway. So I've done all that work for nothing. It's much better to just very gently block things in and then only move on to more details when you are certain that everything is in the right place and that everything is kind of the right scale in relation to one another. Another thing I'm doing right now is I'm looking for what are called visual landmarks. I'm comparing like where the top of the skull is in relation to the top of the bottle and the top of the plant. The bottom of the bottle in relation to the bottle of the spool. Where the vertical edge, back edge of the block is in relation to the vertical edge of the bottle. All right, there's hundreds of little landmarks like that you can use for measurement and comparison. You can also use your pencils to measure the height of objects. Use the tip of your pencil and then just put your thumb at the bottom. So like right there, that's kind of from my vantage point, from the tip of the pencil to my thumb, that's the height of the bottle. So I'm going to kind of decide, okay, the top of the bottle in relation to the skull is about there. And then the bottom's going to be about there. That's where my thumb mark was. Okay. And again, this is all just estimation, right? You will have to, it's not 100% accurate. You just sort of have to make a close, educated guess and then adjust when necessary. There's the spool. There's my little Batman guy next to the spool. There's the spoon. But see, you might not even be able to totally see this from the camera, but here's the plant. And then here's I'm not worrying about drawing individual leaves on this plant yet. I'm just kind of getting the overall kind of triangular shape of this. All right, and already, see, I'm seeing I have to maybe scoot this over just a bit because this back edge is just kind of touching the back edge of the bottle. So I want to make sure that that's accurate. And there's the bottom of the bottle. Bring it down a little bit more than where my mark was. Okay, so this is just a series of dashes and lines and marks. I mean, I could map this whole thing out with just squares and rectangles right now, because again, I'm just getting the height and the width of the objects in relation to one another. I'm not even worrying about petals on this flower. I'm just kind of looking at the entire object as, a shape. And is that shape the proper scale in relation to the skull? You know, all these other things. That's all that matters right now. No one cares about details. I don't care about what the skull looks like. I don't care about the little bumps on the lime. It's not important right now. Just getting the height and the width of each object. And if you are, again, following those 3 L's, light, loose, and large, if you make a mistake, and you will, I can already tell you I'm going to have to go back and probably scoot some things around once I finish this initial pass. It's going to be so much easier for me to do that because I'm drawing so light and sketchy. Okay? But already you can sort of see how I'm very faintly starting to, this is starting to take shape. And what you're going to want to do is just any drawing you do, or painting, or anything for that matter, is basically a series of layers. You're going to do multiple passes over this drawing. And with each pass, you're going to work the entire drawing, but you're going to work from general to specific. And you'll hear me say this a billion times. That means you start off with the big relationships like scale, proportion, positive, negative space. And then with each pass through the drawing, you start to focus more and more on specifics, on details. Then that, as the drawing progresses, then you start worrying about little petals on the flower, or Batman's face, or, the little bits of thread on the spool, the details on the skull. Those things happen gradually, right? But right now we're establishing the foundation of the drawing. That has to be strong, otherwise the rest of it isn't going to be any good. That's why when you build a house, you start with the foundation. You don't worry about details like shutters and shingles and the color of the paint. That comes last. Right now we're building a house. Our drawing is a house, and this is the foundation, okay? So we're just making sure that everything that we are doing here is accurate in terms of those essential building blocks. All right, so I am going to, hopefully you guys can kind of make out what I'm doing here. But right now, your drawing should just look like this. Really light and faint. And, this is going to, again, make it easier for you to make corrections later on. All right, so I'm just, again, drawing with the side of my pencil, and I'm barely putting any pressure down on that pencil. And I'm just very lightly blocking out shapes. I'm looking at the negative space between these objects. I'm looking at where objects overlap one another. Maybe they just barely touch or overlap. And if I see something that's wrong, I erase it and I fix it. I'm already seeing a couple things that I have to correct here with this. All right, so I'm going to go through several passes here to get this to the next stage. So I will probably switch to time lapse so that you can see the next part of this develop gradually. And then we will talk about the next stage later. But for now, here we are. So I'm going to switch over now, and it'll take too long if I do this in real time. So I will switch to time lapse, and then we'll do the next bit. All right. So see you back on the other side of that. Okay, so I've spent a little more time on the drawing now. Once I blocked everything out, then the next step was just going over the very faint kind of preliminary drawing that I had. And it's just a matter of kind of, I don't know if you could tell from the time lapse or not, but basically, you know, I was just kind of gradually tightening areas, looking at the still life constantly. Every few seconds, I'm looking back and forth between the still life and the drawing. That's very important because you've got to refresh that visual memory. And I just started being more specific with my mark making with each pass that I made over the drawing. Now, this drawing is still not finished, not even close. I still have more things that I have to do with it in terms of, you know, and again, you don't have the benefit of being able to see the still life right now, but there's all kinds of really delicate, specific kinds of edges on these leaves of the flower. It's kind of a serrated kind of edge on the leaves that I want to try to capture. There's a lot more I want to start tweaking in these leaves here. There's more I need to do as far as details here on the little Batman and in the skull. I mean, it might look to you like this thing is almost finished, but it's really not. The next stage is going to be taking it to the next level of doneness, quote unquote. And this is going to also involve something called line quality, which is kind of a separate conversation that I'll probably save for another video after this one. But I'll still talk about it as it pertains to this drawing. But basically, line quality just means it's pretty much the last thing that you do in a drawing, kind of like that last 5 or 10%. And what it is it's just really getting super specific and sensitive with your mark making. You guys remember the first couple weeks of classes, you know, when we were doing our contour drawing and mark making exercise, I was always telling you to think of your hand like a seismograph, and you're very sensitively recording every slight bump and ridge and change in direction on the edges of your objects. That's sort of what line quality entails. I basically want each object in this drawing to feel distinct from one another. And I want to try as much as I can with my mark making to make, you know, that flower feel as sensitive in the drawing and as delicate in the drawing as it looks in real life. Same with every other object here. If it's smooth, I want it to feel smooth through my line work and mark making. If it's rough or bumpy, you know, bumpy like the lime, kind of rough but yet also kind of, I don't know what the right word is, like the concrete kind of texture of this base of the plant, have it feel, you know, a little heavier than some of the other objects. Have, you know, the little plastic Batman feeling kind of smooth and slick, like plastic. The glass bottle feeling very smooth like glass. I don't want all of my line work to be the same for every object. I want to kind of give the drawing a sense of variation in how I'm mark making. That's when I'm probably going to switch over to my ebony pencil next. Everything I've done so far, I kind of was able to do with the number 2 pencil and an eraser. But now I'm going to start really getting specific with a very sharp ebony. So I will do another time lapse for that stage, and we'll continue going until we get this in a more finished state. All right, so again, this drawing's still pretty rough. There's still a lot of scribbly marks in the lines, which you may or may not be able to tell in the video. There's still a lot of underdrawing visible, especially like in the skull and in the plant. You can still see where I'm drawing through some of those forms to get an idea of what the back edges of like the cube look like. So, there's definitely more to do here before I would consider this finished. Again, I know many of you would stop at this point and say, okay, that looks great. But we are, I'm going to try to push you guys further than maybe you're used to going or that you even think is possible. And again, I want to keep it linear. If I were doing a value drawing of this, there'd be a whole other stage where I'm going in and shading everything and adding shadows and highlights to each object and giving it a sense of, highlight and shadow. And we're going to do lots of that a little later on, but for this first still life, I want to keep it linear. I want to see what you can do with just this kind of being a modified contour drawing. Okay? So that's going to be the next stage, and I'll do that in the next video. But for now, this is, kind of the end of the first stage of the drawing, and then we're about to enter the more final phase. So this is kind of like the first half, or maybe even a little more than first half of the drawing, which was just very faintly blocking things out, making sure, everything's accurate in terms of the spacing, looking at the visual landmarks, comparing the heights and widths of objects to other things, seeing that the negative space matches up to what I'm seeing in the still life, and just making corrections on the fly as I go. So if I notice that something is off, I'm just going to erase it and fix it right there, and I'm not scared to lose anything. It's like I'm just going to erase it and redraw it. If it's not right, it's not right, and putting it off and not correcting it and leaving it for later isn't going to do you any good. So just if it's wrong, fix it right there. Don't get too attached to anything, all right? If you drew a little something and you really like it, but it's wrong, it's got to go. So just don't get attached to it. If you drew it once and it looked really good, then you can do it again, okay? So, and we're about halfway done with this drawing now, a little more. The next step, again, is still adding more detail, getting more specific even still, and adding line quality to edges and things. All right, so that's coming up next.